So we'll officially get started. I have half past the hour on the dot right now. I'll post one more time our general information here. You can see more, you can see Terrell Starr's website and also official YouTube channel. Thank you so much for being here. As I said the last time we met with the reboot, I might smile too much today than is warranted by the current state of the world, because I'm so happy to see Olha and Rahman and also to have Terrell Starr here, and so grateful to have them here. And I'm happy that all of you are joining, because there's lots of things you could be paying attention to, and you're still paying attention to Ukraine. And it means a lot to have your time and attention. So we want to welcome Terrell Jermaine Starr, who is here with us on screen now. You can see his official website and YouTube channel there. Terrell is a person of many accomplishments. Terrell is a Fulbright scholar, or former Fulbright scholar in Ukraine, and did Peace Corps service in Georgia, has also worked with the Atlantic Council, and is an independent journalist who's widely known for his coverage of the current war of Russia against Ukraine. His YouTube channel, if you go to the link in the chat there, says, "I am that black dude that talks about Ukraine. I also love talking about race and foreign policy and why we should all be invested in defending each other's humanity. I publish studio interviews, explainers, and reported feature stories that help people feel better connected to each other." And I read that out verbatim from your YouTube channel because I think that maybe is one of the best introductions I could give, and also is why we're so happy that you agreed to be on our speaker series today. So I'm actually going to just immediately turn things over to Rahman to get our conversation started right away so we can make the most of our hour here.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for this wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm glad you keep joining our sessions, our webinars, and I'm super thankful to Terrell for finding the time to meet with us today. A brief story surrounding how I got to know Terrell. Basically, about 2 years ago, I attended an online event at Harvard Ukraine Research Institute, and Terrell was a guest. I don't know if Terrell remembers that meeting. So that's how I got to learn about Terrell and got to hear his story. And then about 8 months ago, I watched a podcast called Explaining Ukraine with the famous Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko, who happens to be a friend of mine. And I found this conversation fascinating. And then about a month ago, I ran into Terrell at one of the most recent big meet events in Kyiv, which is the event that brings together all the international volunteers and Ukrainians who fight for the cause and support Ukraine's resistance and victory. And then so basically I approached him and said, "Hey, I know who you are." And we started talking, and it was beyond the small talk. And it was, something that Terrell said in one of his interviews is like how he likes being emotionally curious about people who are different from you. And that was obvious in that conversation that I had with Terrell. And so one of my questions to him was like, "Hey, are you interested in being a guest at one of our webinars?" So that was a month ago. And he said yes. So we connected on LinkedIn. And then about a couple of weeks ago, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I know it's going to be Peace Corps Week coming up, the first week of March. That could be a good time for me to be a guest at this webinar." So here we are. And Terrell, we typically begin with two questions to all of our guests. One is a light one, and one is more fundamental one. So the light one is, again, we used to ask people how are they doing, but this time I wanted to see if you could tell us what's the best thing that happened to you today, besides the drone attack that is happening right now, and besides this webinar, obviously.
Uninterrupted electricity.
I agree. So, yeah, this is something that we used to electricity take for granted, but now, not having interrupted electricity is a gift. Yeah, I agree. I echo that. So the most fundamental question, the most serious question is, how do you define Ukraine's victory?
Ukraine's victory is one where humanity exists in their self-determined liberation. I come to this question as a Black person who was born and raised in the blackest city in the United States, which is Detroit, Michigan, and has spent my professional adulthood in New York City, which has the highest number of Black people in any given city in the United States, because my mother is from Detroit, father's from New York. I live in a world where my mentors were raised in Jim Crow. And so I understand what authoritarianism is, and the way that white Western pedagogy explains democracy. I find it quite insulting to Ukrainians, because it's the white man wagging his nose, his finger at you, saying that you need to do this and you need to do that. Meanwhile, we can, American democracy is really more than 50 years old out of its 250-year history. Yet we come, when you think about 1970, when the various civil rights acts, voter rights acts, housing rights acts were implemented. And so Ukraine became free, independent in 1991. So essentially, America has roughly a 20-some year jump on Ukraine when it comes to democracy. But that 20 years is articulated to people here as 250 years, which is false. And so I don't come into this conversation merely with an analytical lens. I come with a lived experience that my pastors, my godmother, my mother, my grandmother told me that everyone has a right to feel and exist in. And so my understanding of Ukrainian liberation came from me exploring my own ignorance about whiteness, which is a major theme of my work. And so when you asked me a question about liberation, I didn't think that Ukrainians required liberation, because in my young 20-something mind, I felt that whether you are Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian, et cetera, you are all the same, because you're one big blob of whiteness. And I didn't understand what liberation looks like for somebody who in America is considered white. And so when I first went to Peace Corps in Georgia, and the Georgians, who are considered Chordany or Black within the Russian sphere, in that context, they showed me how ignorant I was, and that they too sought liberation from people who looked at them like dogs. And so when I specifically say exist in liberation that is self-determined by Ukrainians themselves, that means a complete exception of Ukrainian culture, literature, language, and the whole 9 yards, which is something that's very germane to the Black experience. And Ukrainians are still, the pleasure and the honor that I have of being in Ukraine is that people share their stories with me and trust me by understanding what their liberation looks like and what they're seeking. And so it looks like one where not only Russia respects their sovereignty, it's Americans respecting Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian self-determination. Because quite frankly, one of the main things I think about when I say this is that you still have people at the Associated Press who told Ukrainians that the way that they spell Kyiv is wrong. And so the very type of whiteness that demeans and intellectually insults us, insults Ukrainians and the people who in my 20-something mind I thought was white. And so self-determination, definitely from Russia, but also self-determination that's respected by Western capitals.
Well, thank you for this answer, I guarantee you that I'm going to go back to this recording and rewatch it at least twice to be able to understand and absorb things that you've said. Because out of, I think, 20 plus guests that we have had on this webinar, we've never heard definition of victory as a liberation, but also going beyond Ukraine-Russia war. And
Have you had any
I'm
other person on here who was black, who graduated from a historically black college, who
nope.
grew up in a largely black city, who grew up in a Detroit that was largely segregated from people who raised me, who grew up in Jim Crow, and people who, even when I'm here in Ukraine now, who engage me on this because they think I understand them. So, of course, my response is going to be different because the way I exist in this world is vastly different from most people who are in this conversation. I am the first and only Black person to graduate from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign with a master's degree in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. And my goal and bucket list is to have more people to do that. And so part of it is because, frankly, and you didn't ask me this, but I'll close out with this, is that to exist and find a space for yourself in this, and for myself in this conversation has been relatively isolating because the experiences that I have first, I love Ukraine. I'm an expert in this region. The only thing I'm mastering, the last thing I'm mastering is language. I have everything else down. I'll add that I've had to create a space for myself to belong because no spaces are created for people who look like me and come from my experience. And so I think that in many parts explaining it, because of my experience, I'm going to have a different lens through which not only I analyze Ukraine, but but also analyzing the country in which I was born and raised, and my descendancy from slavery is going to inform that.
Yeah, and that's exactly one of the reasons why we invited you to this webinar. I thought you would be a perfect guest. And there's so many questions that I want to ask you right off the bat based on what you just told me, but I think we're gonna get back to them later on. You mentioned, oh well, first of all, how's your Ukrainian coming along? I knew you were gonna find a Ukrainian tutor like a few months ago, about 8 months ago. How's that coming along?
Я учуся українською мовою, але мені потрібно як українською мову більше more, більше is big, more,
Yeah, yeah, більше.
більше практики.
Так. Well, you're doing great. It's чудово.
But I need more time. Мені потрібно як українською мовою рем'я.
Час.
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 Мені потрібно I need time. Час. More time.
Час.
I'm learning how to conjugate and like the adjectives and like all these other things, but like I'm working on it.
You're doing great, and you're doing great on the accent too. Well, you've mentioned. Oh, sorry, you wanted to say something, right?
I was just going to say in the Q&A, Andy Linux said, I'll tutor him. You have an offer of a
Okay.
native speaker. And also Douglas Teschner says hi to Ramon. So I'll throw that
Oh,
out there.
nice. Hi, Doug. It's good to see you. It's good to know that you're on this call. You've mentioned the Peace Corps, your Peace Corps experience in Georgia, and I know you. I've looked up, I've listened to all your interviews, not all, but some. And I know you arrived in Georgia in 2003, just 2 years after Peace Corps established its office in Georgia, and only 1 year before the Rose Revolution, which brought to power Mikhail Saakashvili, who is now serving time in jail in Georgia, and then only 5 years from the Russian invasion of Georgia. You briefly told me about your experience, and you were an English teacher in Georgia and living
Yes.
in a small remote community, which is predominantly Azeri, I think, Azerbaijani,
Not
Georgia,
Armenian.
Armenia. Okay. Can you briefly, and I know there's so many people on this call who are either former Peace Corps volunteers or Peace Corps staff who are doing great things for Ukraine. I know each one of them is supporting Ukraine in various ways. And I personally know dozens and dozens of former Peace Corps volunteers, as we call them, returned Peace Corps volunteers, who have returned to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, um, like yourself, to support Ukraine from within Ukraine. So I want to acknowledge their presence today, their service before and now. That means a lot to me personally and everyone on this call. But Terrell, back to you. What was your experience like serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Georgia at the time? And maybe if you can comment on your experiences um, talking with people, whether or not anticipating or not the Russian invasion. And you briefly talked about it already, and how you now living in Ukraine in retrospect, connecting those two experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer in Georgia and now as an independent journalist in Ukraine. Because I know several friends of mine who work for Peace Corps in Georgia who follow you
Okay, yeah,
um,
yeah.
and learn about Ukraine through you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so I was slated to first serve Peace Corps in Russia. And so this was 2022. I was supposed to be in Russia in August of that. I'm sorry, August of 2002. Yes.
That's
I
when Putin
graduated.
kicked Peace Corps out of Russia.
Yeah, yes, and Putin kicked Peace Corps out of Russia, and from there, Peace Corps reassigned me to a different place. I said I wanted to be in these spaces where, that was under USSR, what have you, and so they, sent me to. They gave me options, and I randomly picked Georgia out of several Central Asian countries, and Moldova, etc. So when I went. Again, the first thing beyond the beauty of the country and the food, and that's something that everyone talks about, but the experience that I had was being the first Black person to complete Peace Corps there. And what I started noticing was people would speak to me like they the homies, like I'm like there was a way that the Georgians would communicate with me, and the questions that they would ask me would be different from my white counterparts. And it wasn't anything unique. It was just more of they felt like I would understand them without them actually saying that. And I didn't pick up on it until one guy, we were in my village, and this is after I swore in and became a volunteer. He was talking about doing construction work in Moscow, and he talked about how they were racially discriminated against them. And that's the first thing that stood out to me. I'm like, dude, you're a white boy. Like, how are you going to be racially discriminated against? But again, this is my young, early 20-something ignorance about race and not appreciating what the Caucasus are and who the Caucasus people are. And he's like, dude, they treat us like Black people like you. And I'm like, no, you don't, right? And even if his example wasn't exact, my mind was too narrow to appreciate the larger point he was making about his experience. Now, the advantage that I had was that I was in a village for 2 years. So it wasn't like I was going anywhere. So, and I was there and I had to learn the language, learn Georgian, and it forced me to live outside of my comfort zone, right? So, Black dude at that time, I'm in Detroit, Michigan, the largest Black city in America, and I graduated from a historically Black college. So I went to school with all Black people, and my education was centered in Blackness, Black church, Black life, Black everything. I go from that to being in a little village living on a farm in Georgia, and that speaks to how great the Peace Corps program is, because I think that it's the ultimate equalizer of bringing all Americans together so that we can not only learn about the host country, but we learn about each other. And so that was the most enriching life experience for me. And it inspired me to not only be intellectually curious about the world, but it taught me to have an intellectual and emotional dexterity and flexibility about what the Black experience could be. And I learned that from my colleagues, my fellow volunteers, as well as the host nationals. And so so for me, it was a lot of emotional and social and intellectual growth. So as a human being, I became better by being a Peace Corps volunteer. And the people intellectually, I'm skipping through it. I met the U.S. ambassador there who said, Terrell, I think you will make a great diplomat. And the ambassador, his name was Dick Miles, and his wife was Sharon Miles. They were both diplomats. But they worked as civil rights workers that were registering people to vote before they joined the State Department. And so I had a connection with them that way. They took an interest in me and said, I think that you should take a part in to get a graduate degree in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies, and I will write the recommendation letter for you. And so they saw something in me that felt that I could be a representative of America. And coming from somebody like Dick Miles, who has been an ambassador 4 times, that meant something. And not to mention that they devoted 1 year to helping my people to vote. So I had an emotional connection with them, and they understood me. And they saw me as an investment in the next generation of people to talk about foreign policy. I ultimately did not go into diplomacy in the State Department realm, but I'm using those skills and as experiences now as a journalist. However, Peace Corps I don't think that I would be where I am if it was not for Peace Corps. I know I wouldn't. I would not be the open-minded person that I am. Not saying that I was closed-minded, but the person that I have developed into would not have happened were it not for me being in that village in Georgia for more than 2 years, and having my colleagues from Idaho, from Missouri, from Iowa, that were exposed me to music and, just things that I didn't think about in my own world. And so the commonality of our humanity, that theme that I'm pushing, comes from a personal growth experience. And people are drawn to me because I'm open to saying this is where I've had to grow and be better. And people are inspired by that because they want to be better human beings too. And so those conversations in Peace Corps have allowed me to share stories about how they can participate in that growth of being better human beings as well.
Well, thank you for this answer. I think you just made a lot of people associated with Peace Corps very happy. Um, um, and I just want to comment that, as Ukrainians and Georgians feel very connected in many ways, historically, and speaking of their most recent history, culturally, I mean, there's mutual love and trust when it comes to Ukrainian civil society and Georgian civil society. So I have not met a single Ukrainian who, after coming back from Georgia, said, I didn't like that country. There's
Yeah,
instant
yeah,
love.
yeah.
There's instant love. So, yeah, well, thank you for your answer. I feel like, every time you answer my question, I already have like at least 10 questions lined up. But I have to stick to the plan because there are so many other things that I want to ask you. So I know you, I think your first, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think the first time you arrived in Ukraine was in 2009. And I think you've traveled, based on what I've heard about you, and uh, you've traveled around Ukraine quite extensively. You visited Crimea, you visited parts of
Mhm.
Donbass, which are now occupied. So you remember what Ukraine used to be like at that time. One of our questions that we had been thinking about with our team was, what's the difference between Ukraine that you remember back then versus Ukraine of 2022? But I would like to expand on that a little bit and say, what's the difference, if any, you find in Ukraine or in within Ukrainians between 2022 and now?
Pulling this up, I wanted to to say apples and like the difference between this and this, apples and bowling balls. This is a different world. And here's my lens. When I came to Ukraine 2009 through Fulbright. I actually visited in 2008, but that was a visit. But when I first started my Fulbright, it was 2009. I described Ukraine back then as it having this gray Soviet fog in the sky, and then you had the sunshine on the other side beaming through, like trying to beam through. But the Soviet fog was just so powerful that it could never be as sunny as it could be. That's how I remember it. It felt it felt definitely it felt behind Georgia in regards to infrastructure, in regards to just how you dealt with city services and or dealing with like the bureaucracy. Because when Saakashvili came in, he shut all that stuff, and that's a whole another conversation about Saakashvili. But one thing that he did was like the way that the government worked for people just completely changed. You had a lot of people who spoke English, da 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 da. Here, when I came, it was Ukraine, but it just felt like it was fighting like this. It was like it felt like an internal fight and battle between what they wanted to be. Are we? And I remember because Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yanukovych ran in that election went down the middle with Yanukovych prevailing, and the international community saying that this is largely a free and fair election on the most part. And what I remember was that a lot of the people were ambivalent about NATO, the European Union. I traveled to Donbass, Crimea, and people were quite friendly to Russia. And even then, intellectually, I'm thinking, okay, these people treat y'all like shit. And I'm like, okay, it makes me think, as a Black person, what's our relationship with our occupier and what's our relationship with our former masters? It's not the exact same thing, but my mind, which is more mature at the age of 29, was trying to explore how Ukrainians were navigating this cultural battle, because that's the main thing I felt then, because all the places and again, like you talk about food, all this other stuff, like that's just typical touristy stuff. But being embedded here, it was difficult to not observe how like this Soviet battle, like this battle of wrestling itself away from its Soviet past, like that was very prevalent and dominant. Because now, another irony was that the State Department did not pay for Ukrainian language; they paid for Russian. If I wanted to get Ukrainian lessons, I would have to purchase those on my own. There was in that, and they only paid for Russian language through what was called the Critical Language Enhancement Award. So I took 6 months of Russian language, which I can use not like natively to this day, but I can speak Russian, effectively to get what I need to do, and even do a certain level of interviewing. But now I'm walking down the street, it's 50-50 Russian, Ukrainian. And I go in, there's a bookstore, Sense Bookstore on Krashadik Street that has a sign on its door that or letters, wording on its doors that basically read, you can come here to have tea, drink, catch up, whatever, but do not speak Russian. That type of very, this is clear about who we are, did not exist then. It was not nearly popularized, or it was not in vogue to be this defiantly Ukrainian. And I sat back, I closed my mouth, and I opened my ears, and I was trying to learn and gather as much as I could about how they're navigating it. Because what was interesting is that when I went to Lviv with a group of friends, I noticed that they automatically switched to Ukrainian. I didn't have the in-depth cultural knowledge to appreciate why they made that switch. I understood why they say I want to be respectful. I just thought it was just a general linguistic switch that was customary, but there is so much history and pain and trauma in that switch that I did not appreciate then, but I certainly appreciate now. So those were the major differences. This grip for this tussle, this cage battle that Ukraine has had with themselves about the cultural trajectory of their country.
Wow, thank you. Actually, I can relate to some of the things that you've mentioned. And obviously, you were talking about your Kiev experience, where you hear 50-50, 50 Ukrainian, 50 Russian. Whereas if you go to Lviv or other places around Ukraine, especially if small communities, it's predominantly Ukrainian speaking communities. And as I recall my experience, going back, say, 20 years ago, where there was no requirement to provide services exclusively in Ukrainian. What you would observe in the capital of Kiev at the time was a group of people, standing in line, waiting to get a cup of coffee, speaking Ukrainian or Surzhyk among themselves. And then once they reach the counter, they would automatically switch to Russian. Uh, Whereas now it's the opposite. You would sometimes hear people, standing in line speaking Russian and waiting for their turn, and then as soon as they reach uh, the counter, they would switch to Ukrainian because all the services have to be provided in Ukrainian. That This is something that well, in your daily lives, in your family, in your private life, you can speak any language you want, basically. But it was really fascinating to hear to your experience going back 20 years ago,
Yeah,
because I
friends,
can I can
finally,
totally relate to it.
yeah, just to close out, the ways in which I help people understand Ukraine, I use my journalism and so I use my journalism to help inform my thoughts. So, for example, I've had conversations with people from Donetsk who were forced to flee in 2014, tell me about how hard it was for them to even move to come to Kyiv because of how they were stereotyped, as being as being pro-Russian. You guys deserve this, and a lot of people from Donetsk were telling me two things. One, had Russia not invaded in 2022 full scale, there were people here that would have been fine with how things were, the status quo. Again, it's not I'm very careful about how I assert my opinion in like these local conversations where I'm just giving you feedback of how a lot of people, when we have beers and to say, talk, share things with me. But then also they were saying that unfortunately, my Ukrainian friends were saying that it took Russia brutalizing us to realize that they hated us. And that resonates with me because, again, I don't think I have to be Ukrainian to appreciate how difficult it is for oppressed people to break from their masters. Because Black people have had that experience in many respects. Again, it doesn't have to be across like copy version of the same thing, but oppression at the end of the day is oppression. And and so anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Terrell. Look, I have two questions related to what you said at the very beginning. I think they're very important to the audience and very
Mm-hmm.
important to me personally. But before I do, I'd like to pass the floor to Sarah because I think she has questions that should keep in track of from the
Well,
audience.
I do. I have
Or
my own questions, but I'm going to prioritize the audience questions. I was just going to note that Vera had earlier on said when you spoke Ukrainian, Terrell, that she understood you very well. And she says that she met three African American women at a Ukrainian festival in Denver 3 years ago who were in the Peace Corps in Ukraine, and they spoke fantastic Ukrainian in just 3 years ago. And she was
Mm,
brought to
very
tears
good.
by that.
Good. There
So.
you go. I'm happy. I wish I knew them.
And then Volnov is saying, I cannot say as much as I'm at work, but as a Black Ukrainian living in America with proximity to whiteness, it is as the first time you can go natural hair wise and take back what it means, if that makes sense. And
Yeah,
she's
yeah, yeah, sure.
and they say taking back Ukrainian and finding power, taking back natural blackness from oppressive norms, etc.
Yeah, I get. Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
yeah,
And I would like to meet this person. If she can reach out to me, because I know a number of Black Ukrainians here and also in the States. So if she reaches out to me, I'm just interested in how she got to the States. But yeah,
Yeah, we can
yeah,
put you in touch.
all
Absolutely.
right.
yeah. Well, you just mentioned, keeping in touch with the Ukrainian community, with the Black community in Ukraine. I know you've done a lot of interviews with African Ukrainians or the Black Ukrainians living in Ukraine, and I find those fascinating. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that, about your experience talking to the Nigerian community, maybe other African Americans who live in Ukraine and report from Ukraine? Because I know we have at least a couple of, Black Americans, former Peace Corps volunteers who are now living in Ukraine, reporting from Ukraine as part of like United 24 initiatives or others.
Here, I'm sorry, repeat the question one more time.
Yeah, what are your impressions of what do you hear from other Black Ukrainians or African Americans living in Ukraine right now? Do you find their experiences similar to yours, especially now during the time of war, or are they different?
The experiences of experience the war for what it is, we all experience that. As far as how we engage our societies, I wouldn't know. Well, I do know. I think because I am professionally trained as a journalist that reports on race and I've taken graduate studies on these topics, they're not going to have the same type of conversations that I have with the people that they know. And that has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that I professionally am trained to talk about race, right? And so the stories and the comparisons that I'm making are probably not going to be theirs. I've spoken with Black people here who um that they don't say much, it's not something that they really talk about. They recognize themselves as being Black, but as a subject, they don't. I always talk, we always have our own experiences with racism. I haven't met one Black person here, be they Black Ukrainians, Nigerians, or say or say Black Americans who haven't experienced some degree of racism. Some people are more comfortable talking about it than other people, and that experience of racism is not germane to Ukraine. That's peripheral with the rest of the world, right? Um, I so that has been a common theme. Another thing I noticed as being a Black American, I can navigate just getting across the borders easier, well, at least than say somebody that's from the continent of Africa. Um, and that's something that has very little to do with Ukraine and more to deal with how the world, particularly the West, treats countries that have formerly colonized and currently engages in imperialistic policies. So, so I noticed that. So when the war broke, I remember, well, in the full scale in 2022, you had the whole situation at the border, which broadly speaking was over exaggerated when it comes to the conversations about racism. The racism happened, but it didn't happen in the way that people were saying it happened, as in there were some state sanctioned plans to discriminate against Black people, which is bullshit. That didn't happen. Other things interpersonally happened, but something from the state down, that didn't happen. But when I was helping refugees, Ukrainians, to go across the border, um, I know I was always in the Ukrainian line. And then I saw the Black and brown people on the other end. And what kept me in the Ukrainian line was my passport. And I was also just helping refugees who were so terrified they didn't want me to leave them. And I actually had to help them. And also, it was just because of my passport, it was just easier to go back and forth across the border. Right. And so I did. And I don't come from a country where that has a passport that's not well respected, where people have to check every single document, whatever. Like me, getting across the border, it was like almost like a Ukrainian, pretty much, or like that, because I just came and went. But I bring that up to say that's important. I am treated differently, and I think it's important as Black Americans that we understand that the lens through which we not only see the world, but the lenses through which we're perceived is going to be elevated because of our passports. It's not fair. It's very unfair. And I think the least that I can do is acknowledge it. And what I did enjoy about my conversations with Black Ukrainians was their parents' experience in the USSR. these untold stories that I'm working to tell right now and raising money for, those are really enriching. And as I'm developing into a journal and developing my independent career, and one of my goals is to amplify these stories through documentaries that I'm currently raising money for. And there's so many stories about people here that are not told because you don't have people like me on the ground or people who are financially backing people like me to tell those stories. I mean, if I had any funding, I would have a whole series of things out right now. But I enjoy those conversations with Black Ukrainians because it just opens up another society um, that has largely been untouched. It's like untouched nature that has not been impacted by industrialization. That's how rich the Black Ukrainian experience is. And I also think about a guy named Dr. Johnson Aniki. I published a story about him on my YouTube channel, and that man has been living in Ukraine for 45 years. And so just this whole conversation about how do they think, what his are his views of Africans who fight for Russia and et cetera. I have a whole this friendship base gives me another perspective of the country that I don't think is embedded or shared with the larger Ukrainian story, and it ought to be.
Yeah, thank you. And I watched that episode, and I actually, those who don't know, the Russians have been actively recruiting, Africans from various African countries to fight for Russia in the Ukrainian war. And that interview that you had with a Nigerian businessman in Ukraine, helped me understand, um, what the Black community in Ukraine thinks about Russians' ways of propaganda, recruitment, post-imperialism activities, funded, by the Russian state with billions and billions of dollars. Um, before I continue, I want to thank you for helping those Ukrainian women and children cross the border, in the early
Yeah.
days of the full-scale invasion. That means a lot to me, and I'm sure them. Um, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and I'm trying to be careful about asking it. One of our former
I'm
guests,
not
Henry,
shy, so ask whatever you want to ask.
no,
I bust people's
I know you're
balls every
not.
day, so don't be shy with me. Go ahead.
No, one of the reasons I'm a little bit shy is that I don't want to misinterpret what my friend Yevgeny Leibovitsky and our former guest had said. So,
Yeah.
based on my recollection of what he said in front of American group of Peace Corps volunteers back in the day, including some black volunteers, he
Uh-huh.
said something like he tried to draw parallels between Ukrainians and Black Americans as they related to their um, colonial experience. I know it's very different, but it's somewhat similar as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think what he said at the time was, you know, between the white and Black Americans, in his view, the Black Americans should have had better chance of understanding the plight of Ukrainians and the
Mm-hmm.
post-colonial liberation movement at the time because you
Mm-hmm.
had slavery in America, we had serfdom in Ukraine, and this is something you discussed with Volodymyr Yarmolenko as well,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
the slavery was abolished in America at the same time the serfdom about the same time the
Yeah. Yeah.
serfdom
Right.
was
Yeah.
abolished
That's
in
yep.
Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
roughly about the same time, like
Mm-hmm.
1860s. Um, so what do you think it's true that our experiences as Ukrainians, historical experiences of dealing with an empire, dealing with the serfdom, are somewhat or not somewhat, but they're similar and something that the Black Americans can relate to? And if
Yes. I mean,
so,
I don't. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
like, how can we Ukrainians be better at communicating this to our Black friends in America or across the world?
Right. So the first answer, the question, the answer to your question is yes. There are many similarities. I know this because I'm working on a class, and I'll announce it broadly. It's called race. It's called BLM, Maidan, and Race. So I'm working on a course that's going to be taught probably next year, right? I'm going to start with the lecture series in Lviv, and again, that announcement will be made public. But I'll be in Lviv for a month. I was invited to, and so I'm going to deal exactly with this, which is why I feel especially qualified to answer the question. Yes, we have the similarities. The problem when we're dealing with pedagogy is that the idea of Western imperialism and Russian hegemony and Russian supremacy is how I coin it and how I describe it. Russian supremacy and white supremacy are aligned. The problem is that Western pedagogy wants to posit Western hegemony and Western culture as not being imperial or colonial, and it doesn't see its own colonial and imperial past and present as a peer to that of Russia, but it very much is. And so if you can't be honest to have that type of conversation, it's pointless because it betrays the truth. America and Russia, be they the Russian Empire, the USSR, and the current Russian Federation, are settler colonial states. They both are. They are settler colonial states that has set up economic and racialized constructs that elevate a certain group of people and minimize the lower in the lower classes. And over here, it was, Ukrainians and everyone else. I was speaking to a Georgian man to help exemplify this story. About 10 years ago, his daughter married a Nigerian guy. And so this Nigerian guy, I met him. He's like, yo, why don't you come to my step-parents' house, my in-laws' house, and we can talk, whatever. I wanted to understand what his in-laws thought about him marrying their daughter. And I brought my whole, my idea of what that was. And I asked him straight up, did you have a problem with it? The mom was like, it's her life. I don't care. She was just very to the point, whatever. The father was a lot more detailed. And he said, I can look at you and tell that you don't understand. So let me give you my story. When I went to Moscow, they treated me like I was a dog. I went to Russia in the 70s. I went to Soviet, I went to their, and they taught us all this. In his words, he's like, they taught us all this bullshit about us being one peoples. But when I was on the street, they were calling me black this, black that. They were calling me nigga. Okay. So this man was like, who am I to treat anybody else this way? So a black person, most black people in the United States are not going to understand this man and his story because that's not how we're taught to appreciate race. So people on our side, we need to grow and expand our minds. On the Ukrainian side, there's a tough decision that they have to make. How much of whiteness are they going to accept? Because I don't believe that the term white accurately describes the regional experience of being under Russian colonialism. It does not. It's an inappropriate term to describe the Ukrainian experience. It is a very accurate experience when you leave it. And whiteness for Ukrainians, because whiteness does exist, and anybody who looks white in our world, in our supremacist world, is white. And we don't make that, we don't make that choice for ourselves. That's a system that we as human beings have to decide that we're going to deconstruct. And so going to the heart of your question, for Ukrainians to better be engaged in, we need to learn more about Ukrainians, but Ukrainians need to learn more about other cultures and peoples too, and black people, because just as they're saying we need to support them during the war and we need more support from the global South, you're also asking other peoples who are also in their own regional conflicts to expand their bandwidth to understand you. And meanwhile, you're getting support from NATO, from the European Union, and the international community lauded Ukrainian bravery and resistance and welcomed Ukrainians by the millions, which has not been the same experience for a lot of people leaving conflicts who look like me and were fleeing conflicts that, be it historical or contemporary, were initiated by the West. So there is a reluctance to criticize Western institutions and Western society because those are the societies that they aspire to. I'm born and raised in the United States of America, and I have a critique of my own country that I think can be jarring for a lot of audiences here because they don't see a whole lot of Black people. You don't have me coming in with my analysis of how I see the world. And so when I come in and I use and I speak this way, it breaks what they're used to hearing. And I think the whole idea of, and so I think for Ukrainians, for them to learn, they have to, I feel like the way that I embedded myself in Georgia and the way that I had to grow, Ukrainians have to do the same for everyone else. And there have been a number of times where I tried to do that between Black peoples, be they Africans, etc., and Ukrainians. And what I have found is that the Black people were a lot more open-minded about what that liberation could look like than Ukrainians. At least like on an organizational level. When you get down to activists, that's a little bit different. But Ukrainians do not, I think, especially when they go to the United States, especially in the ones who are the hardest to move are people who are diplomats, people who go to graduate school, because they integrate into whiteness. And so for them to come from a place where they are the marginalized, because I do think that this is a marginalized experience in this part of the world. You leave it and get a particular type of privilege that just comes from being able to pass as white and integrate into whiteness. And if they don't recognize that, they're never going to be able to build those solidarity communities that they want, because our experience is not going to be the same as them engaging other white people who don't have our stories. And so Ukrainians, I had a friend of mine who was joking with me a few years ago. They saw my content. They saw how how Ukrainians were fighting back against Russia. We had our own subculture on Twitter, on Black Twitter, about Ukrainians. And we were like, yeah, they don't take no shit, da, 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 da. So like we urbanized Ukrainians in the way that we understood them, in the way that we respected them to stand up. Because you're like, we were comparing them to like our urban shows, comparing them to like Black gangsters and all this other stuff in an endearing way.
Wow.
but Ukrainians, I found across the board, don't extend that to us. And I know why, but that's been the main issue. So Ukrainians have to do a lot of the work in that regard. We're waiting on them. We already know this. And ICE picks up Ukrainians. I saw this guy, it was in a Daily Beast interview, saying, I did everything, I paid my taxes, I did everything right. I'm like, you think we as Black people don't understand this? Like we've been known about this. And we want, and so Ukrainians are realizing that their whiteness is on the spectrum and that they just can't integrate and not realize how the very racism that targets us is targeting them. They need to open up their minds and they need to learn and they need to catch up and get better and break out of the whiteness that's holding them back from building better communities with people outside of white spaces.
I agree with you 100%.
I
We
think
just
this
need to
makes
step
it,
out
if
of
I,
that comfort
oh,
zone.
sorry.
Yep. Go
Is it
ahead.
okay to interject?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we have like
Well, I
5
think
minutes left.
this is especially what you were just saying, Terrell, is especially interesting given some of the comments we have. One is from Andy Lennox, who says, not really a question, but as a young kid growing up with newly refugeed Ukrainian parents in the 60s, I always related more to Black people than white Americans. I still do, and I'm glad I have that view. Also, thanks for the Peace Corps plug. And so it is this interesting of what group you identify with, maybe, and the connections there. We have another question, but I can hold off, Ramon, or we can. Also, we have about 5 official minutes left, but
I mean,
No, please
it's
go
up to
ahead.
y'all. It's up to y'all. I'm enjoying the conversation. So whatever y'all decide, I don't have a time crunch. So whatever y'all decide.
should I go with the
Well,
next question?
sure, please. And thank you, Terrell.
So we have anonymous attendee, and we don't have an official policy on this, but if you'd like to identify yourself, we'd love to know who's asking the questions. I think we do sort of want to discourage anonymous participation, but I understand sometimes why people might choose that. But they say many progressives who are calling for global solidarity now with Venezuelans, Iranians, and Palestinians completely leave Ukraine out of the conversation, in my opinion, wrongly so. What do you make of that?
How long has it been since Ukrainians collectively viewed themselves as colonized peoples? Because I remember a time when across this space, the word colonialism was something that people looked at with shame and said that's for Africans. So the academics may have been a part of this discourse, but by and large, this whole conversation, again, I can be corrected. And if I'm wrong, then I'm just wrong about it. And I'll say I'm wrong and I apologize and I need to educate myself. But in my interpersonal engagements with people, I have found that Ukrainians rejected that term for a while. Not only Ukrainians, but Georgians did it and other peoples did it. I think that if you lived under the Soviet Union, you are a colonized people, right? So a lot of it deals with, I think, a lot of bias, shame, and then a little bit of racism on this end. And in the West, Western pedagogy does not tend to want to characterize white people as colonized. That's another thing. Because if Western pedagogy and academy started saying really the truth about how all imperialism pretty much has one goal, and that America is one of the biggest imperialists in the world, then you're going to be educating people to be more critical of their government and their policies, right? And so going back to the thing about Palestine and Venezuela and Iran, I agree that they should be bunched in the same way. However, Ukrainians are not, again, I'll deal directly with Palestine. I think if anyone follows me or listens to me, they know my position on this because I've been very open and very outspoken about it. I definitely have criticized the Israeli government. I've been to the West Bank and they treat those people like shit. It's one of the dehumanizing experiences that I have ever experienced in my life. I think it's shameful, and I think that it is a failure in humanity to see what America has allowed and has sanctioned, and I will die on that hill. That said, I also have the same energy about Ukraine, which is why I'm here. And I have found that Ukrainians cannot build, in order for Ukrainians to be in that bunch, they have to earn it, and they haven't earned it. We can say what we want about Palestine, but I remember in 2014, anytime, whether you're a journalist or whether you're a protester, it's the Palestinians that were saying, if these cops fuck with you, this is what you need to do. Like, they throw that tear gas at you, this is how you do it. When the BLM movement broke out, the way that the local media here was racist as hell. And in 2014, and beyond, the whole discourse here has been rooted in racism. And I think that when Ukrainians go to the United States in particular, and I know this because people tell me, and it's not like there is some course where Ukrainians take and they say, this is, you need to hate Black people. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I found that with many Ukrainians who travel to the United States, they learned to build up biases against Black people. And much of it may have started when they were here. But then when they talk with their white friends say things to them that, say things to them that they would never say to another Black person. So, and I know this because my Ukrainian friends have told me this. So, Ukrainians, I wrote an article called, I wrote an article a few months ago about the Ukrainian woman who was killed, Irina Zarutska. It was my most successful Substack article, and I said Irina Zarutska is not a white woman. And what I did was I talked about the ways in which Trump talked about her, and the only reason he did it was because she was killed by a Black man. But then on Valentine's Day this year, another Ukrainian woman was killed by a white dude named Caleb, and he didn't say anything. I talk about, and then recently I've been talking about how Irina Zarutska's my mother, was invited by the White House, and in my language, how she was her mom was pimped out politically for white nationalist consumption. And so the very racism that targets us indirectly impacts them. And so my training in this in the way that I'm able to talk to you not only comes from my master's degree in Russian East European Eurasian studies. It doesn't just come from my expertise in traveling across this region and interviewing people. I understand critical race theory. I understand the intersections of race and education and politics. Because if you don't understand race in America, if you don't understand race, you don't know anything about America. You don't. And I have found that Ukrainians never have any intellectual interest in that, be they educated at the highest levels of academia in the United States to the common person who goes and drives a Uber. They're just intellectually and socially disinterested in engaging us. And so if they want, and it's a very privileged attitude. And I'm not speaking directly to the person who made the comment, but I find that Ukrainians don't want to earn our respect. They don't want to build relationship. They just want us to join in and support them like everyone else. I'm the exception because this is my field and I have a particular passion for it, but they don't want to build community. They just feel entitled to it because the rest of the world do it. And here's the biggest irony, and I'll close with this, is that the people who are more likely to elect a pro-Ukraine official is a Black voter. I was asked, and I'm not going to get into that, but it's just a fact. Black people, when you crunch the data, if it wasn't for Black people overwhelmingly supporting Joe Biden and that other person got into office, how well would Ukraine be positioned? Those are Black voters who elect people who support Ukraine. Politically or electorally, the most important voter for Ukraine is the Black voter because we don't elect fascists or support fascist parties. The other side, with their European, Irish, and Norwegian, and French and Italian ancestry, do. So I'm not going to drone on about it. It's just a challenge for them. If they want to build community, they need to have a seat and put in the work to do it, because the Palestinians and the Palestinians at least, and the other groups have done that. They need to do it too.
Andy Linnick has a question directly about this. He's asking, is this perception true for the Ukrainian diaspora? So it sounds like you're talking about Ukrainians in Ukraine. Do you want to comment about the Ukrainian diaspora?
They're the same.
Okay.
So yeah, they're the same. And I'll tell you what, another thing that's hard is that even the way that I'm engaging in this conversation, I'm not going to toot my own horn or say this arrogantly. I am pretty sure that in all of the conversations you had, no one has spoken about Ukraine or America in the way that I have. I'm pretty sure that that has not been the case. And so you have to appreciate how isolating it can be for me. I frankly, I've been coming to Ukraine since 2009. I live here. Um, and people ask me, did you go to this event? And this event is mostly Americans. I don't hang around with the Americans. Nothing against them. I spend more time in my neighborhood and talk with folks here because I feel more comfortable with them. So I think that the main thing with the diaspora, so I'm saying all this to say that it's difficult. I feel like I'm speaking another language because I don't sound like Ann Applebaum. I don't sound like Timothy Snyder, who's a great guy. I know, and Marcy Shore, who are great people, right? I'm different, and I know when I speak is different. And imagine me going to, and so I've been in I get the good thing, I get invited to all the Ukrainian stuff, and it's great. What I also know is that it's very white. And I have had to, I feel like socially, my social whatever has adjusted to that over the decades. And that has happened for me to socially be inculcated and engaged in the society. I choose to do it, but I've had to map out a world for myself that draws these intersections because it's the only way that I can fit in, because I'm not at a think tank. I'm not at any of these other places, right? Precisely because of the stances that I've taken. And I think that also when I talk to some Ukrainians about America, sometimes they forget that I'm Black. And what I mean by that is they're not used to talking to Black people, and they may say things that are kind of, I think, a bit racist. Not trying to be like overtly, but a lot of these people have never talk about America to a Black person who's educated in talking about the subject, and they're not used to a Black person that's talking about Ukraine and drawing all these intersections because their audience from America has been consistent mostly of white boys, and I'm not that. So I mean, all of this is important when you think about building solidarity, because it's like, who are you going to be socialized with? And I've spent 2 decades to be where I'm at. A person who was an activist from the Black Lives Matter movement or wherever is not going to come from that. And so there's going to be a requirement of flexibility on Ukrainians' part to join the struggle and break away from some of the whiteness that ultimately pulls all of them in, because it does.
Thank you for that. If you have time, we have a very different kind
That's
of
cool.
question.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's cool. That's cool.
And like Ramon said, I'm gonna have to go back and watch this recording 3, 4 times to fully like synthesize and not synthesize, it's not the right word, but to absorb all of the layers of meaning, I think, in what you're saying. Beverly Kingston, who is a colleague of mine at the University of Colorado, is saying, thank you so much for this presentation. I work in the field of violence prevention, and I'm especially moved by your perspective on social and intellectual growth, and how that can be applied to the work we're doing with youth from historically under-resourced communities. Can you share how you see your work being able to impact violence prevention in the US? And do you also speak to groups of youth, which I think might be I could be misinterpreting. I think that might be a request, but could you share how you see your work being able to impact violence prevention in the U.S., and do you speak to groups of youth?
I could conceive that my work possibly doing that. I would love to participate in that. And it resonates with me because I grew up in a house I grew up in the 1980s, and both my uncles sold crack. When people ask me who do I look to as the people who inspired me in diplomacy, I talk about my uncles and they sell crack, and most people that throws them off, right? Like, can you imagine you're in some fancy think tank and you're talking about diplomatic influences? People bring up an ambassador or a foreign minister or some Nobel Prize winning person, fancy stuff. But I'm a boy from the hood. My uncles who sold crack. That's who it is. And the reason why I say that is that they're the smartest people I know who were caught up in a society and the world where they were just set up to fail. And the reason why I didn't fall into their traps is that in large part I was lucky. And so you're talking about violence prevention, my home environment was so rough. My first experience with a gun was at 11 years old. And at 11 years old, I used that gun to almost kill my uncle because he was addicted to crack. And so I had to grow up really fast. And so I have direct experience with violence. Like my uncle sold crack, neighborhood, the local neighborhood gangs would come in, jump, jump my uncle. I would have guns down to my head, and I'm like 10 years old. So like I have intimate experience with violence. And I also have experience with going through mental health treatment in my early 30s, because I had PTSD that was undiagnosed, right? And it drove me into deep depression, having mental health issues. So I have personal, intimate experience with that. In regards to how, that helping others, yes, I could definitely see my work including youth. I don't talk to them. I'm not invited to talk to youth, even though I would be more than happy to do that. I really believe that people who come from my background are particularly qualified to be in positions to inform how we view the world. Because to me, foreign policy is, in a nutshell, how do you want to exist in the world? Similar to urban planning. Urban planning plans where the parks are going to be, where the school is going to be, where the shopping mall is going to be, who's going to live in whose neighborhood and which neighborhood, et cetera. Foreign policy is just an expansion of this very domestic a way of mapping out communities and worlds and how people live and exist. And I would like to see more people who come with my background to talk to people about youth prevention, because I think so much of what helped me was that I benefited from programs that targeted youth, that showed me what the possibilities were. Because one of the main things that stop Black boys, now I say Latino boys as well, is that we're not taught to dream. We're not taught to think beyond where we are. We're not taught to think about our possibilities. And a lot of that has to do with masculinity, with patriarchy, with all those things. But Black boys, Latino boys, because those people are the ones who tends to be in these type of environments for a wide range of reasons. We are not taught to believe that our minds can influence how the world exists. And I can tell the story of how I was able to live through those experiences, become educated, and learning that the world that the same issues or some of the similar societal issues that created my environment in different ways can create the type of circumstances that I'm reporting on from Ukraine and across this region. So there's definitely a parallel that I would be more than happy to talk through with young people, and hopefully my experience would be useful to them.
Thank you, Terrell. Well, you've been more than generous with your time, and again, we can stay as long as we want. We still have like most people on this call, which is really impressive.
I mean, if you want
Um,
to ask me a couple more questions, I'm good with it, because when I first did this, I'm like, am I gonna like this? Are they gonna be? But I'm one of those people. I like it. This is a good conversation. I'm thinking through things, even for my own future writing. So go ahead. You can ask me a couple more questions. It's up to you.
I'm glad that you don't, that we've made a good enough impression that I credit that to Rahman, really. Andy Lennick is raising his hand. Andy, do you want to, if you want to put something in the Q&A, you can. Rahman, do you have another question you would like to ask? And for our audience, if you're still here, I mean, thank you. We had a little over 30 people, and we still have about 20 people here. So if you do have a comment or question, you're welcome to put that in the Q&A. I did want to note that Carol Dobson said she was eager to spend time on your website, that you had she thought this was an excellent webinar, and she said, yes, U.S. whites need to grow and look at so much differently. I'm heartbroken to live in Minneapolis's culture these days, much to process. Thank you. Thanks to all of you, and hi to Rahman. Yeah, thank you, Carol. And Karu Bolding said, thank you so much for this conversation. Very thought-provoking and important. And what's great is that, I mean, I'll just say I appreciate, I have colleagues who do not focus on Ukraine who have joined this webinar. And that means a lot. Yeah. Rahman?
yeah, just a couple of quick questions, I guess. Those are I usually use for closing. One of them is like, what is this one question that we never ask you? And then the other question is, you're really good at what you do, reporting from Ukraine, in my opinion. Speaking of the Black people who are vocal about supporting Ukraine, besides you, I only know, and I have to admit it, it's Mark Burns, I guess. It's the Trump spiritual advisor, who's been, I expected that laugh from you, Terrell. But who else do you happen to know other Black Americans who've been vocal about supporting Ukraine civil
Yeah,
society?
sure. I laughed at Mark Burns because his whole relationship with Black people is something else, but I'm not going to delve into that. But I think people should know, people that you all should know about. Number one on the list is Kimberly St. Julian Barnon. Now, she speaks Ukrainian fluently. You should definitely think about her, or consider, this is for Peace Corps. Maybe this is for Peace Corps people, but Kimberly has a PhD in history. She's a fluent Ukrainian speaker. She could do this. I think she could do this whole thing in Ukrainian. She's definitely the linguist between the two of us. And she focuses on the intersection of race in Russia and Ukraine. It's definitely her expertise. And as far as other Black people, I'm pretty sure they're out there. I don't know. So I'm not going to I'm not going to try to strain through it. I just don't recall anyone else who really focuses on it. But Kimberly, definitely check her out.
She's amazing. I've read her work before. She's great. And I know a PhD student at Arizona. I mean, like you said, Terrell, I mean, this affirms, at least I've spent 20 years in the academic study of the region. There are not many Black people studying the region.
No, no.
I do know of a graduate student at Arizona who's doing Russian politics who does really interesting work,
Okay,
as
I'd
well.
like to hear from. I would like to be connected with them if that's
Okay.
possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and we have in the Q&A, I'll just say we have a lot of thank yous. Thank you, super interesting perspective from Meg. Thank you from Mikael. Andy Lennick is saying he wants to invite you to talk to his class of Ukrainian students if you're willing. So I'll put you, we have lots of follow-ups to do after this.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I'm in Ukraine for those who are on until May 12th. I go home for a month. I'm going to go vote. I believe in engaging my democracy. So I'm going to go home to New York and vote in the primaries. And And so I'll be back here in June, but definitely between now and May, let's say at least May 10th. If the classes are here, I'll be more than happy to come in and talk.
Yeah, and I think they're in, well, they're not in Kyiv. Andy is in the US. They do it on Zoom, but the Ukrainian students are in Ukraine. But that would be interesting too, to if it were
That's
input.
cool.
But they did, yeah. Anyways, I don't want to get us off on that too
Yeah.
far here. But yeah, I'll put you in touch. I'm making a note of everyone to put you in touch with afterwards.
Well, and Terrell, I hope we'll have a chance to reconnect, maybe meet for tea, coffee, beers, whatever. Because I'd love to learn from you, hear your personal stories, see if we can be beneficial to one another in the work that we do, like both volunteer work
Yeah,
and
sure.
educational opportunities. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Is
I'm
there
looking
anything
forward
we
to it.
can do to support your work and help you? We don't always ask that explicitly at the end, but I think we should start asking.
No, you know what? Doggone. I wish I would have said it. Like, yeah, so I am an independent journalist. So there are a couple things. One, definitely follow my YouTube channel. And I also take donations for my work. I have an amount of money that I raise every month to keep things going. And I have a Venmo and Cash App and PayPal. And I didn't even think to put the links in. But they're on if you go on Twitter, you'll find the links there. And so I definitely would appreciate that. Follow my social media accounts. I'm Terrell Jermaine Starr, so Terrell J Starr across all my social media accounts. That includes Instagram and Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. Terrell J Starr. You can find me, and I have my own face. My face, I'm easy to find. So that would be a primary. That would be a primary way.
Thank you so much. Дуже дякую.
All right.
I echo Sarah. Thank you, Terrell. I think it's definitely one of the most fascinating webinars that we've had in a long time.
Hey, I
Yes.
appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here, and I'm always eager to share my version of how I see Ukraine in the world, but also my personal growth. I was particularly happy to be asked about the violence profession. I wasn't expecting that, but it was a great question because I have a lot of personal experience about that, and I think that speaks to another thing. Like so much of why I am passionate about Ukraine is because I have my own relationship with violence, like violence that has happened to me, happened to my body, the history of violence on Black people. So I understand it personally in my own experiences, and also in just I come from this Black tradition, this legacy experience. And so I've had to spend a lot of time emotionally processing that, which why I think that even through my ignorance, I had this willingness to grow, and I've evolved into a person who is able to have the bandwidth and the patience to build these relationships and this cross solidarity. So I didn't finish this point earlier. So whoever you were mentioning, Roman, who was making this comparison, I think that it's actually very healthy that people make the attempt. And that attempt does not have to be perfect. People need to try to build a bridge. The bridge is going to have to be adjusted. There are going to be some mistakes, some bricks moved a few centimeters to the left where they should be moved to the right. But if you're trying to build a foundation and a bridge, the intent matters, because I know you're trying to build a bridge, and because I know your intent is good, let me help you build it. And so a correction is not a condemnation. A correction is, how do we build a bridge so that we both can cross it and not fall? and and that's what I'm about. And that's how, and a lot of that's going to require the truth. That's going to be uncomfortable. But intellectually, I've spent these past 20 years being uncomfortable. And it's made me a better human being. And I think if everybody else learns to navigate their own discomfort, they'll be better human beings too.
Thank you for saying that. And in our previous talk, actually, not to brag, but one of the questions was like, how do we engage those who are not typically supporting Ukraine? And I say, step out of your comfort zone, be uncomfortable, talk to the people that you don't typically spend time, but know nothing about. Maybe, try to understand their perspective, try to tell them about your perspective. So as a follow-up to this conversation, I suggest that we find a day and time to meet with the friend of mine who made those parallels. Yevhen Leibovitsky, he heads the Frontier, the Institute of the Frontier. He speaks English, he lived in the US. I think both you and him and I will benefit from getting to know one another. He's also
Let's
friends
go
with
to a
all.
drunken monkey. So listen, let's when people say this, they say we'll do it and we don't do it. So Roman,
We'll do it. Roman follows through.
I
so
will, yeah,
basically, let's do it next week. Ask if we could do, I'm open to
yeah,
do it next week. Let's go to the Drunken Monkey. It's in Padil. It's my friend's bar. They have great
sounds
beers.
good.
So Padil, Drunken Monkey, and name a time I'm open. So connect with
I
him,
know the
confirm
place.
it as soon as possible, and
Absolutely.
let's get it on
Absolutely.
schedule next
And
week.
all our attendees have to promise to come back, which they will, and more.
So,
I have to add really quickly, I know we're way over time, but the first time
Yeah.
I met Roman was in a webinar like this, sort of. It was in a Zoom meeting, and he corrected very bluntly and very rightly, and corrected what I was saying about Ukraine, or like how I was talking about things. And that was uncomfortable because it's not like fun to have that happen, but like very important, and has led me on a different path of understanding of sort of how to think about the country. And so like it really resonates with me that like discomfort's not a bad thing.
Well, Sarah, the thing about we're all intellectuals here. Discomfort is not discomfort, is growth. The thing about intellectuals is that our minds always expand. It's like a muscle. And when your muscles grow, sometimes you grow outside of your clothes. And the way you correct that is by new ones
Yeah,
that fit
I love that.
where your body is. And that's the same thing about your mind. So your mind, Roman was your trainer. You grew. That's good. And I tell and my brain grows all the time. But if you're an intellectual, that comes with it. Because we're supposed to be the ones where it's where is where that's supposed to be second nature to us. So you just grew. That's all.
yep. And I'm so humbled to be in such a company. I'm learning from all of you. So Sarah, and I've learned a great deal from you as well. But Terrell, the last most important question and probably the most difficult one.
Yeah,
It's Friday night in Ukraine, in Kiev. What are your plans?
I'm staying home because I'm enjoying this electricity, and it would be so my hangout days. So it's usually Saturday. People ask me what I do here, and people back home are amazed. You can get to a whole bunch in Kiev easily. Like, if you're an OG like me, you know how you can get around. Like you're not going to be if you're bored here, it's your fault. Um, it just is. So I know. But tonight, it just feels like I don't know. Like I feel like light is a new invention. Like I'm just here, like marveling at this stuff coming down. Like shit, like I'm playing with this thing. Like I'm like a monkey with like a toy that like with an iPad or something like that. Look at this. Like wow, because you're just not. We've been going without it for so long. So I'm just going to sit up here and like deep dive into YouTube and get ready for tomorrow because yeah, this is and you talking about Fridays. I think this is the first Friday where I haven't had uninterrupted electricity. Now, this is not Traishina in all these other places. they're cooked. Like they still got a lot going on. But for me, I'm staying home and enjoying the electricity.
Simple pleasures.
Yeah.
Well, Terrell, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Looking forward to I'll come back on anytime. Y'all have a good one.
Thank you.
Too.